Hello! I would be very pleased if you would like the video. Subscribe so you don't miss new videos every day that will help you relax. I'm also curious where you are listening to me from and what time it is now. Write it in the comments. Enjoy watching. Please subscribe. In this story, we'll step back in time to a world of frost-covered tents, the crackle of campfires, and the quiet determination of men fighting for a country that did not yet exist. You'll walk beside one of them, a simple soldier, neither a hero nor a name written in history books. Through his eyes, you'll feel the hunger, the fear, the brief moments of laughter, and the unshakable hope that one day, freedom would not just be a dream whispered by generals, but a truth lived by ordinary men. Across 11 chapters, we'll follow him through a single day, from the cold dawn of a Continental Army camp to the silent, star-filled night after battle. It's a day that mirrors thousands of others, one that shaped a nation not through grand speeches, but through the endurance of those who kept standing when everything around them was falling apart. So settle in, take a breath, and listen closely. This is not the tale of glory. It's the quiet heartbeat of revolution. The world was still dark when the first sound broke the silence. A soft clatter of tin cups, the faint murmur of men stirring from uneasy sleep. The camp of the Continental Army lay stretched across the frozen Pennsylvania field like a wounded beast, smoke rising from dying embers. Frost had crept over the canvas tents during the night, turning their edges white. Inside one of them, Private Thomas Hale opened his eyes to the dim glow of a smoldering fire. He had learned not to expect comfort. The ground beneath him was hard, the blanket thin, and the cold unforgiving. But for Thomas, a farmer's son from Massachusetts, this had become life. Each morning began in the same way, a slow, aching return from half-dreams of home to the harsh truth of war. Outside, someone cursed as a kettle tipped over. A horse neighed somewhere in the distance. The smell of smoke and unwashed wool filled the air. Thomas rubbed his hands together, feeling the numbness that never quite left his fingers. He pushed aside the flap of his tent and stepped into the pale gray of dawn. Rows of tents stood silent in the mist, their shapes ghostly against the lightning sky. A few men were already awake, silhouettes moving slowly, shoulders hunched against the cold. Beyond them, the low hills of Valley Forge stretched out under a shroud of fog. Winter was loosening its grip, but only just. The wind still carried the bite of ice. Thomas walked toward the fire pit where a handful of soldiers were gathered. Corporal Jenkins, a broad-shouldered man with a beard thick as rope, was coaxing a flame from damp wood. "Morning, Hale," he grunted without looking up. "Sleep well?" Thomas gave a tired smile, as well as a man can when his bed's a rock and his pillow's his own arm. Jenkins chuckled softly. "Luxury, that is. I've slept on worse." The others murmured in quiet agreement. Around them, the camp began to wake. The soft murmur of hundreds of men, the clink of canteens, the shuffle of boots. Somewhere, a fife began to play, thin and reedy, a sound that seemed both fragile and defiant against the cold. Thomas crouched by the fire, holding his hands out to the small flame. The heat was weak, but he savored it. A few moments later, a soldier passed by carrying a pot of thin broth, breakfast. It was mostly water and bits of old bread, but no one complained. Hunger had long ago become a familiar companion. As he ate, Thomas's eyes drifted toward the distant line of trees beyond the camp. Beyond those woods lay the unknown, the land where the British Army moved, where scouts whispered of red-coated patrols and ambushes. Somewhere out there, the war waited, silent for now but never gone. He thought of home, as he often did in these quiet hours before orders were given. He saw his father's hands, rough and scarred from years of work. He saw his mother's smile, his sister chasing chickens in the yard. The image came easily, but holding it hurt. It reminded him that every sunrise he saw was one they might never share again. "Letters came in last night," Jenkins said suddenly, pulling Thomas from his thoughts. "They're passing them out by the command tent." Thomas rose at once. Mail was a rare mercy, weeks, sometimes months apart. He joined the line of men waiting, hearts half afraid, half hopeful. When his turn came, the officer at the table shook his head. "Nothing for Hale," he said. Thomas nodded quietly. He had expected as much. His family's farm lay far from any town, and letters were costly to send. Still, the absence stung. He stepped aside, watching others tear open crumpled envelopes, their faces lighting up with small smiles. He was happy for them, even as a hollow ache spread in his chest. By mid-morning, the camp was fully alive. Orders were shouted, muskets inspected, drills begun. The men formed ragged lines in the open field, their breath rising in clouds. Officers barked commands, boots stomped in rhythm. Thomas fell into step, the old flintlock musket heavy in his hands. His body moved by habit now. Load, aim, fire, reload. Each motion drilled into muscle and bone. As the day grew brighter, the sun broke through the haze, glinting off the metal of bayonets. From a distance, it might have looked like a real army. Proud, disciplined, unstoppable. But up close, the illusion faded. Their uniforms were torn, their shoes worn to scraps. Many fought hunger as fiercely as they fought the British, yet still they stood, shoulder to shoulder, bound not by pay or glory but by belief that freedom, though invisible, was worth the suffering. When the drills ended, Thomas wiped sweat from his brow and looked toward the horizon. A hawk circled above the hills. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, or perhaps it was cannon fire. No one could tell anymore. He returned to his tent as the day stretched toward noon. The air had warmed slightly, and a faint smell of pine drifted from the forest. Thomas sat on a wooden crate, writing what little he could on a scrap of paper, a letter to no one, perhaps to himself. He wrote of the cold, the hunger, the waiting. And he wrote, too, of hope, fragile as the paper in his hands, yet still alive. "We are tired," he wrote, "but not broken. The world may forget our names, but I pray it remembers why we stood." Outside, the sound of a bugle broke the stillness. The men stirred again. Another order, another march, another day in the life of a soldier. Thomas folded the paper and tucked it inside his coat. Then he rose, slung his musket over his shoulder, and stepped once more into the light. The sun had climbed high, burning away the last of the fog. Ahead, the path wound toward the unknown, and he followed it, one step at a time. The order came shortly after noon. The soldiers were to break camp and move east, toward the river. No one knew why, but such questions were rarely asked. Orders were orders, and the army moved as one, weary, silent, and obedient to the rhythm of war. Thomas tightened the straps of his pack, slung his musket over his shoulder, and joined the long column of men assembling near the tree line. The sun hung pale and distant, filtered through a thin veil of cloud. It cast no warmth, only light, a cold reminder of the season that refused to end. They began to march. The sound of hundreds of boots rose in unison, crunching over the frozen soil. Leather, wood, and breath blended into a steady hum, a heartbeat of determination echoing through the valley. Thomas fell into step beside Jenkins, neither speaking at first. Words seemed too heavy for the thin air. The path wound through a stretch of barren woodland. Naked branches clawed at the sky, and the wind whispered through them like the ghost of something lost. Occasionally, a bird took flight, startled by the sudden presence of men. Otherwise, the world was still. Even nature seemed to be watching them pass. Hours slipped by, each one identical to the last. The march was endless, a slow grind that wore on the spirit more than the body. The weight of the musket, the pull of the pack, the ache in his feet, all of it blurred into a single, dull pain that never quite left. Thomas focused on his breath, on the rhythm of his steps, because thinking too deeply could break a man faster than any bullet. By late afternoon, they reached a small clearing where the officers called for rest. The men dropped where they stood, grateful for even a moment's reprieve. Jenkins sat beside Thomas and pulled a strip of dried meat from his coat. "Not exactly a feast," he muttered, "but it keeps a man upright." Thomas nodded, chewing slowly. Hunger dulled the taste of everything. Nearby, two younger soldiers laughed quietly, passing a dented canteen between them. The sound was strange, laughter in a place like this. Yet it reminded Thomas that they were still human, still capable of light even in shadow. He found comfort in that small, fragile sound. For a moment, it almost felt like peace. As the men rested, Thomas looked toward the horizon. Smoke rose faintly in the distance, perhaps a farmhouse, perhaps something else. The officers spoke in low voices, their faces tense. News had spread that British scouts were moving nearby. The men pretended not to hear, but unease rippled quietly through the camp like a cold wind. When the order came to move again, The sun was already beginning to fall. Its pale glow painted the forest gold and crimson, turning every leafless branch into a work of fire. Thomas felt a strange calm watching it, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Soon, the light would fade, and with it, the illusion of safety. The march continued into evening. Their shadows stretched long behind them, swallowed one by the growing dark. Voices became whispers. The rhythm of footsteps slowed. Someone began humming softly, an old tune from home, and others joined in, their voices blending with the wind. It was not a song of triumph, but of endurance. By the time they reached the river, night had nearly fallen. The water shimmered in the fading light, slow and silent. The men set down their packs, some kneeling to drink, others staring across the dark expanse as if it marked the edge of the known world. Thomas knelt by the bank, cupping icy water in his hands. It bit at his skin, clear and alive. Across the river, a small farmhouse stood alone among the trees. A single lantern glowed in its window, a flicker of warmth in the encroaching cold. Thomas watched it for a long time, imagining the lives inside, a family, perhaps, gathered by the fire, unaware of the silent army watching from the dark. For a moment, he envied them. They made camp nearby, building fires with what little wood they could find. Sparks rose into the night, vanishing among the stars. The men spoke in hushed tones, some praying, others sharpening bayonets by dim light. The smell of smoke and wet earth filled the air, the scent of war and waiting. Thomas lay back, staring at the sky. The stars seemed impossibly bright, unchanging, eternal. He wondered if his family could see the same ones now, far away beyond the fields of home. The thought was both comforting and cruel. Distance, he realized, was the truest enemy of all. Somewhere nearby, Jenkins spoke softly. "Tomorrow, they say, we move toward Trenton. Might be a fight waiting there." His voice carried no fear, only fatigue. Thomas nodded slowly. He felt no thrill, no dread, only a steady acceptance. Whatever awaited them, they would meet it as they always had, step by step, breath by breath. As sleep crept upon him, the sounds of the camp faded, the low murmur of voices, the crackle of dying fire. Above him, the sky stretched vast and endless, and for the first time that day, Thomas allowed himself to hope. The stars, cold and distant, seemed to whisper a promise. The dawn will come again. The dawn came softly, painted in pale silver mist. The river beside their camp shimmered faintly, and the world seemed suspended between night and day. The men rose slowly, their movements quiet and deliberate. No one spoke much that morning. There was a heaviness in the air, the kind that always came before change. Thomas packed his few belongings and slung his musket across his shoulder. The weight of it felt different today, heavier somehow, though nothing had changed. Jenkins offered him a brief nod as they fell into line once more. The march resumed, quieter than before. Even the birds seemed reluctant to break the silence. They followed a narrow path along the riverbank, mud clinging to their boots. The morning fog curled low, hiding the world beyond a few yards. Every sound seemed sharper, the creak of leather, the snap of a twig, the rasp of breath. Thomas felt the tension spreading like frost beneath his skin. After an hour, the column halted. Officers whispered among themselves, their expressions grave. Scouts had returned from ahead, their faces pale and urgent. Thomas could not hear the words, but he didn't need to. The message was written in their eyes. The British were near. A quiet command rippled through the ranks. "Prepare arms." The sound of flintlocks being primed broke the stillness, harsh and final. Thomas checked his musket, fingers trembling slightly despite the cold. He had trained for this, drilled for it countless times. Yet now, as reality approached, his heart began to pound like a drum. They moved forward again, slower now, crouched and cautious. The trees grew denser, their shadows long and watchful. Somewhere ahead, a branch cracked, not from wind, but from weight. Thomas froze. The entire line stopped as one. Then came the faintest glint of red through the fog. A coat, a shoulder, a musket barrel catching light. A shot rang out. The world shattered. Birds exploded from the treetops. Men shouted, and the calm morning erupted into chaos. Smoke filled the air, thick and acrid. Thomas dropped to one knee, loading his weapon by instinct. Powder, ball, ramrod. His hands moved faster than his mind could follow. He fired into the gray and heard someone scream, though he could not tell from which side. The forest became a blur of motion and noise. Flashes of light, the crack of muskets, the heavy thud of boots on mud. Orders were shouted, lost, then shouted again. Men fell and vanished into the fog. Thomas could barely see Jenkins a few feet away, his figure flickering like a ghost through the smoke. "Hold the line!" An officer bellowed somewhere to the left, but lines meant little here, where trees and shadows swallowed men whole. Thomas fired again, the recoil jolting through his shoulder. The scent of gunpowder burned in his throat. Somewhere behind him, someone prayed aloud. A redcoat lunged from the mist, bayonet flashing. Thomas stumbled backward, heart slamming in his chest. He barely had time to aim. The shot went off with a deafening crack, and the man fell. For a moment, the forest went silent again, save for the ringing in his ears. Thomas stood frozen, staring at the body on the ground. The man's face was young. Too young. Jenkins grabbed his arm. "Move!" he shouted. More musket fire erupted behind them. Together they ran for cover behind a fallen tree. Splinters flew as bullets tore through the bark. Thomas ducked low, pressing his back against the wood. His hands shook uncontrollably, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "First time seeing it this close?" Jenkins asked between gasps, forcing a grim smile. Thomas nodded, unable to speak. "You'll learn," Jenkins said quietly. "The trick is to keep breathing. The rest just happens." His tone was almost calm, as if speaking of rain instead of death. Minutes dragged like hours. The fog thinned, revealing glimpses of movement. Redcoats retreating, bluecoats advancing. The sounds of gunfire grew distant, then ceased altogether. Slowly, silence returned to the forest, broken only by the groans of the wounded. The fight had lasted less than an hour, but it felt like forever. When the call to cease fire came, Thomas rose shakily to his feet. The ground was littered with torn branches, dropped packs, and still bodies. Smoke drifted through the trees like ghosts unwilling to leave. He stared at the fallen redcoat from before, his musket slipping slightly from his grasp. The boy's eyes were still open, staring upward at nothing. Jenkins placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't look too long," he said softly. "You'll start to see yourself." Thomas nodded, but the image burned into his mind anyway. He had imagined war to be grand, filled with banners and heroism. But here, it was just mud and blood and silence. As the men gathered, officers took count. Some names went unanswered. Others answered twice, trying to fill the void. Thomas said nothing. His throat was tight, his chest heavy. Around him, the survivors reloaded their weapons, readying for what might come next. The world had not ended, only changed. By midday, the army had reformed and begun to move again. The wounded were carried on makeshift stretchers, the dead left behind until they could be buried. The fog had lifted now, and the sun glared down, bright and indifferent. Thomas walked in silence, every step echoing with the memory of that first shot. They reached an open field and stopped to rest. The air smelled of smoke and damp soil. Jenkins sat beside Thomas, pulling a flask from his coat. "You did good," he said simply. Thomas shook his head. "I was scared." Jenkins chuckled softly. "Everyone's scared. Brave men are just the ones who keep walking anyway." As evening fell, the army camped once more. Fires flickered weakly against the growing dark. Some men sang. Others wept quietly into their coats. Thomas sat apart, staring at his hands, still trembling, still real. He thought of home again, of his father's fields and his mother's voice. He wondered if they would ever know what this day had cost. When the stars returned, they seemed colder than before, yet somewhere deep inside him, beneath the fear and exhaustion, something had changed. He had faced death and was still standing. The war would not end tomorrow, nor the day after, but for the first time, Thomas understood what it meant to fight for something greater than himself. And as he drifted toward uneasy sleep, the echo of musket fire faded into the distance, replaced by the quiet hum of life continuing, fragile, stubborn, and free. The morning after the battle came without fanfare. No drums, no fife, no words of victory, only silence. The fog that had hidden their enemies now lay heavy across the camp, softening the edges of everything it touched. Thomas rose slowly, every muscle sore, his body a map of bruises and fatigue. The fires from the night before had burned low. Men moved quietly among the tents, their faces drawn and pale. Some cleaned their muskets, Others sat staring at nothing. The sound of coughing and murmured prayers filled the still air. War, Thomas thought, was less about fighting and more about enduring what followed. A detail of soldiers was sent to the forest to gather the fallen. Thomas was among them. They carried shovels, not rifles, stepping through the mist where yesterday's chaos had raged. The ground was scarred with footprints, musket balls, and blood-darkened mud. Here and there, a red coat or blue sleeve protruded from the undergrowth, a grim reminder of how quickly life ended. No one spoke as they worked. The only sounds were the scrape of shovels and the low rustle of wind through dead leaves. Thomas knelt beside one body, its uniform torn, the face unrecognizable. He hesitated, then removed his hat. The man could have been anyone, friend or foe, and it no longer mattered. In death, all uniforms looked the same. Jenkins stood a few yards away, helping lift a fallen comrade into a shallow grave. His expression was unreadable, eyes fixed on his work. "You bury one," he said quietly. "And it feels like burying a piece of yourself. But you can't stop. There's always another." Thomas said nothing, but his hands trembled as he shoveled the earth. By midday, they had laid dozens to rest. Some were marked with wooden crosses, others left unmarked, names lost to the fog of war. The chaplain spoke briefly, his voice hoarse and soft, a single verse about peace and home. The men listened, heads bowed, their hearts too heavy for words. Afterward, Thomas walked to the river to wash the dirt from his hands. The water was cold, biting, but it cleared the soil from his skin. He stared at the ripples spreading outward and wondered if they would ever stop. If war, like the river, would simply keep flowing until it swallowed everything in its path. As he turned to leave, he noticed a shape caught among the reeds, a piece of red cloth torn from a British uniform. He lifted it gently, the fabric stiff with dried blood. For a moment, he thought of the man it once belonged to, and he felt a strange sense of kinship. Both of them had been sons, perhaps brothers, caught in something neither could escape. Back at camp, the men were gathered around a small fire, eating what little rations remained. Someone passed Thomas a tin of thin stew, and he accepted it silently. The taste was bland, but the warmth was enough. Jenkins sat beside him, chewing slowly, his eyes distant. "Hard day," he murmured. Thomas nodded. "Feels like they get harder." Jenkins gave a tired half-smile. "They do, but you get harder too. Not colder, just tougher where it counts." He tapped his chest lightly. "In here." Thomas wasn't sure he believed that yet, but he wanted to. Later, as the sun began to set, an officer gathered the men to speak. His voice was steady but low, carrying over the camp like a prayer. "We fought bravely," he said. "We held the line, and though we lost good men today, we showed the enemy that this army will not yield." A murmur of agreement moved through the ranks, quiet, but real. Thomas watched their faces in the fading light, tired, hollow-eyed, yet still standing. There was something unspoken that bound them now, stronger than any command. It was not glory or hatred, but understanding. Each of them had seen death and chosen to keep living. That was its own kind of courage. When night fell, the stars appeared one by one, brighter than before. The air was still, carrying only the faint crackle of the fires and the distant cry of an owl. Thomas sat alone for a long time, staring at the heavens. He thought about how small they were beneath that endless sky, and yet, how much weight their choices carried. He took out the scrap of paper he had written on days earlier and added a few lines in shaky handwriting. "We buried the fallen today. I could not tell one side from the other. Maybe that is how peace begins, when we forget the colors and remember the faces." He folded the note carefully and tucked it inside his coat once more. Around him, the camp settled into uneasy sleep. The war was far from over, but tonight, beneath the quiet stars, Thomas felt a faint flicker of calm. For the first time, he did not dream of home. He dreamed instead of tomorrow, of the men beside him, of the promise that somehow, through all this darkness, something better might yet be born. The order to move came at dawn. The air was sharp and cold, heavy with mist that clung to every surface like breath made solid. The soldiers packed what little they had, worn blankets, cracked canteens, half-empty pouches of powder, and fell into line once more. The earth beneath their boots was soft with thawing frost, every step sinking slightly into the mud. Thomas walked among them, his musket resting against his shoulder. His body still ached from the battle, but the ache had become part of him now, something as constant as his heartbeat. Ahead, the road stretched like a gray ribbon through the bare trees, winding south toward Trenton. No one spoke. Words seemed to freeze in the cold air before they could form. The army moved slowly, the column stretching far into the distance. From above, it might have looked like a river of motion cutting through a dead forest, men flowing forward without knowing where the current might take them. Each carried his own silence, his own memories of what had been lost. Yet together, they formed something unbreakable. By mid-morning, the fog began to lift, revealing rolling fields patched with snow. A few scattered farmhouses stood along the road, their chimneys trailing thin smoke into the pale sky. The sight stirred something in Thomas, a memory of home. The smell of wood smoke, the shape of a roofline, even the sound of a distant dog barking brought warmth to the frozen edges of his heart. As they neared one of the farms, a woman stepped out onto her porch. She was young, her face pale and thin, a child clinging to her skirts. The soldiers slowed as they passed, some tipping their hats in silent respect. She gave a faint nod in return, eyes filled not with fear, but with sorrow and pride. Thomas met her gaze for a moment and saw in it everything they were fighting for: life, family, the fragile promise of peace. The officers allowed a brief halt nearby. The men rested by the roadside, melting snow hissing against small fires. Jenkins sat beside Thomas, sharing a crust of bread. "Strange thing," he said, tearing it in half. "We marched through land that looks like home, but it feels a world away." Thomas nodded. "Maybe that's what we're fighting for, to make it home again." Jenkins smiled faintly. "Aye, and maybe someday we'll walk these roads without muskets on our backs." His tone was light, but his eyes held a quiet yearning. Around them, other men spoke softly, of farms they'd left behind, of wives and children waiting, of fields they hoped to plow again when the war was done. Each word was a small act of defiance against despair. As they resumed the march, the road grew rougher. Patches of frozen mud gave way to stones, and the men's boots wore thin. Some limped, others leaned on comrades for support, but no one fell behind. The rhythm of their steps, steady, relentless, became a kind of prayer. Thomas found comfort in that sound, a heartbeat of unity that carried them forward. In the afternoon, they reached a small village. The people there came out to watch: farmers, tradesmen, children with wide eyes. Some waved, others offered what little food they had: apples, loaves of bread, jugs of water. The soldiers accepted with quiet gratitude, their smiles weary but sincere. For a few moments, it felt as though the world beyond war still existed. An old man approached Thomas, pressing a warm roll into his hand. "Keep faith, son," he said. "This land owes its freedom to men like you." Thomas tried to thank him, but the words caught in his throat. He nodded instead, feeling something heavy and bright settle in his chest. Not pride, but purpose. That night, they camped near a frozen creek. The fires burned higher than usual, the men speaking in low voices that carried softly through the dark. Jenkins told a story about his father, a fisherman who used to say that no storm lasts forever. The men laughed quietly, the sound warm and human against the vast, empty night. Thomas sat listening, eyes on the flames. Each spark that rose into the air felt like a fragment of hope, small, fleeting, yet stubbornly alive. He thought of the woman on the porch, of the old man's words, of the men around him who still found reasons to smile despite everything. For the first time, the road ahead no longer seemed endless. When he lay down to sleep, the stars above shimmered faintly through drifting smoke. The war was far from over, but something had changed within him. The cause no longer felt distant or abstract. It had faces now, voices, laughter, the small, unbreakable pieces of a nation still being born. And as the wind whispered through the trees, Thomas closed his eyes and whispered back, "For them." The night was black as ink, the kind of cold that seeps into bone and makes every breath feel like glass. The men stood along the riverbank, their figures little more than shadows beneath the dim glow of lanterns. Before them, the Delaware rolled dark and merciless, chunks of ice drifting silently on its surface. Thomas pulled his coat tighter, though it did little to stop the wind. His hands were raw and trembling from the chill. Around him, soldiers moved slowly, their faces hidden beneath hoods and scarves. The air smelled of wet rope, gunpowder, and the faint smoke of distant fires. Every sound, the creak of wood, the splash of oars, seemed magnified in the silence. Orders passed in whispers. Boats were being readied, their hulls scraping against frozen mud as men pushed them toward the water. Washington himself stood near the shore, his silhouette firm and unmoving. The flickering light caught the edges of his cloak, and for a moment he looked less like a man and more like a statue carved by fate itself. Thomas watched him, awe mixing with fear. The general's calm presence steadied the men, as though the storm itself bent in respect. No one spoke his name aloud, yet all eyes followed him. They knew what this meant, a gamble against impossible odds, a strike that might turn the war's tide or drown it entirely in this freezing river. When the signal came, the first group began to board. The boats rocked under their weight, water slapping against the sides. Thomas helped Jenkins climb in, then followed, gripping his musket to his chest. The wood was slick with frost. They sat packed close together, knees touching, breath rising in clouds. The oars dipped into the black water with slow, rhythmic strokes. The river felt alive, a monstrous, shifting thing. Ice drifted against the boat, grinding like teeth. Each push forward was a battle. The cold stung Thomas's face, numbing his fingers until he could barely hold the musket. Yet he dared not move. To tip the boat meant death for all. He stared into the darkness, praying silently that the shore would appear soon. Halfway across, a gust of wind tore through the night. One of the men cried out as water splashed over the side, soaking their boots. Thomas grabbed the edge, steadying the boat with Jenkins's help. The river roared beneath them, unseen but merciless. Somewhere behind, another boat cracked against ice, a sharp, haunting sound that vanished almost instantly. Minutes stretched into eternities. The oarsmen strained, their faces pale and rigid with effort. Frost gathered on beards, on rifles, on the very ropes that bound the supplies. No one dared speak. Only the steady rhythm of oars and the rasp of breath marked their passage. The world had narrowed to water, ice, and willpower. Then, a faint shout from ahead. The far shore. Relief spread through the men like fire through dry grass. They pushed harder, the boat gliding through broken ice until finally the hull scraped against gravel. Hands reached out, pulling them ashore. Thomas stumbled out, legs stiff and shaking. The ground felt unreal beneath his feet. On the bank, fires flickered to life as the men gathered, stamping their feet and rubbing hands to restore feeling. The general's voice carried quietly through the dark, giving orders, calm and precise. There was no celebration, only grim resolve. They had made it, but the hardest part still lay ahead. Thomas looked back at the river, now half hidden by fog. It seemed impossible that they had crossed it. The current still flowed, indifferent to their struggle. He thought of how close they'd come to freezing, to vanishing into that black water without a trace. Yet somehow, they stood here, cold, exhausted, alive. Jenkins clapped him on the shoulder. "We did it," he said softly, a shaky grin on his face. Thomas nodded, too tired to speak. In his chest, his heart beat fast and fierce. For the first time, he believed that perhaps destiny favored them after all. Not through miracles, but through endurance. As dawn began to pale the horizon, the army assembled once more. Muskets were checked, powder kept dry, boots tightened. Across the icy fields ahead lay Trenton, and with it, the enemy. The men moved quietly, ghosts in the mist, the sound of their boots muffled by frost. Thomas took one last glance at the river before turning to follow. Behind him, the Delaware gleamed faintly under the first light of day, a dark mirror reflecting the courage of those who had dared to cross it. And as he walked into the pale dawn, he whispered a promise to himself. This night will be remembered. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, pale and cold, casting long shadows across the frozen fields. The air was thick with mist, muffling every sound but the crunch of boots and the quiet rattle of muskets. The soldiers advanced in silence, breath steaming in the icy air. Ahead, the small town of Trenton lay still, unaware of what approached. Thomas marched near the front, his musket tight in his hands. His body was numb, but his mind burned with a strange clarity. The crossing had changed him. Fear was still there, but now it lived beside something stronger. Determination, resolve, Around him, men moved like ghosts, their faces set in grim focus. As they neared the outskirts, faint lights flickered through the fog, the lanterns of the Hessian outposts. The sound of drums began to echo from somewhere deep within the town. Slow and unaware, Washington rode at the head, his voice low but steady as he gave final orders. Then, with a single motion of his hand, the silence broke. Musket fire cracked through the morning mist. The first volley shattered the stillness like glass. Smoke rolled through the streets, thick and white, stinging the eyes. The soldiers surged forward, shouting, boots pounding the frozen earth. Thomas felt his heart hammering as he fired into the haze, the recoil numbing his shoulder. The Hessians scrambled from their barracks, half-dressed, caught in chaos. Drums now beat frantically, echoing off the walls of Trenton's narrow streets. Cannon fire roared from the American side, deep, thunderous bursts that shook the air. Each explosion painted the fog in flashes of orange light. Thomas reloaded, hands shaking but sure. He could barely see 5 yards ahead, only silhouettes darting through smoke. Jenkins shouted somewhere nearby, his voice hoarse. "Forward! Keep moving!" The men pressed on, stepping over debris, over fallen bodies, pushing through the choking air. Every heartbeat felt like a lifetime. A Hessian soldier appeared suddenly from the mist, bayonet raised. Thomas barely had time to aim. The two clashed, steel meeting steel with a sharp ring. The impact jarred his arms. The enemy's eyes were wide with shock, more human than monstrous. Thomas shoved hard, the man stumbling back and vanishing into smoke. There was no time to think. Around him, the battle raged like a storm trapped in a small space. The air trembled with musket fire and shouted orders. The smell of gunpowder and sweat filled every breath. Yet amid the chaos, there was something different. A sense of momentum, of control. For the first time, the Americans were not running. They were winning. The Hessians tried to regroup in the town square, but Washington's men were faster. Flanking lines moved with precision born not from training, but from desperation. Cannon bursts tore through enemy ranks, scattering them in confusion. Thomas saw the flag raised through the haze, its colors faint but unmistakable, the symbol of the cause refusing to die. By mid-morning, the thunder began to fade. The last shots echoed into silence, replaced by the distant cries of the wounded and the soft hiss of falling snow. The battle was over. Trenton belonged to them. The impossible had happened. Thomas stood in the street, chest heaving, musket hanging limp in his hands. All around him, men laughed and cried, some embracing, others kneeling in prayer. Jenkins limped over, his face streaked with soot but smiling wide. "We did it," he breathed. "By God, we actually did it." Thomas could barely find his voice. "We won." The words felt unreal, fragile as frost. But they were true. The victory wasn't grand or glorious. It was cold, brutal, and hard-earned. Yet it was theirs, and it meant everything. As the officers moved through the streets, securing prisoners and supplies, Washington rode slowly among his men. He spoke little, his expression grave but proud. When he passed Thomas's unit, their eyes met briefly. The general gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of what they had achieved together. In that moment, Thomas felt something bloom inside him. Not pride, exactly, but a fierce sense of belonging. He was no longer just a farmer with a musket. He was part of a story that would outlive them all. The snow began to fall harder now, soft flakes settling over the battlefield, covering the scars of war in white silence. The men huddled near fires, their laughter faint but real. For the first time in months, they allowed themselves to believe. Thomas looked toward the horizon, where the gray sky met the earth. Beyond this day, the war still stretched long and uncertain. But for now, they had done what no one thought possible. They had turned despair into hope, and as the flakes melted on his skin, Thomas whispered into the cold air, "Maybe freedom starts like this, with one hard-won morning." The morning after the battle was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The town of Trenton lay still under a soft blanket of snow, the air crisp and heavy with the scent of smoke and wet earth. The men moved slowly, collecting what they could from the battlefield and tending to the wounded. Silence hung over them like a fragile promise. Thomas found a moment of respite near a small fire, hands wrapped around a tin cup of weak broth. The warmth barely touched the chill in his bones, but it was enough to steady his shaking hands. Around him, Others wrote letters on scraps of paper, their faces lined with exhaustion and thought. Every word seemed precious, carried by longing as much as ink. He pulled out a scrap of parchment and dipped his pen into a small vial of ink. The words came slowly at first, his hand stiff from cold and fatigue. "Dear mother, father," he began, "I write to you after a day I can hardly describe. We fought, and we survived, though many did not. I am tired, more than I have ever been, but I am alive." Outside, the wind whispered through the streets, carrying distant sounds of men preparing for the next march. Thomas paused, listening. He thought of the faces of his fallen comrades, faces he would never forget. Each stroke of the pen felt like a quiet memorial, a way to give life to those who no longer had it. He wrote of the victory at Trenton, careful not to exaggerate, careful to convey the truth. The river was frozen, the night bitter, but we crossed and struck the enemy by surprise. It was terrifying and miraculous at once. We did what no one thought possible. Even as he wrote, the words felt too small, inadequate for the weight of the day. Nearby, Jenkins scribbled furiously on his own paper, muttering under his breath. "Never thought I'd be so grateful for a pen," he said, not looking up. Thomas smiled faintly. In this strange, small act of writing home, the war felt almost human again, tangible, connected to a life that existed beyond blood and mud. The letters became confessions, admissions of fear, of longing. Some men wrote of missing their families, others of surviving moments that had felt certain to end in death. Every line was a tether to a world they were fighting to protect, a reminder that they were more than soldiers. They were sons, brothers, fathers, friends. Thomas paused and looked up from his writing, gazing across the snow-dusted streets. Civilians began to emerge cautiously, peeking from windows or stepping into doorways. Some offered bread or water, small gestures of gratitude and hope. Each one reminded him why they fought, why each step, each bullet, each sacrifice mattered. By midday, Thomas had folded his letter and tucked it into his coat. He watched as a courier collected letters from the men, bundles of hopes and fears bound together. He imagined his own making the long journey home, carried by someone who would never understand the full story it contained. Yet somehow, it would reach them. Somehow, they would know. The act of writing calmed him more than anything else had that day. The battle, the blood, the ice of the river. It was all still there, but for a moment, he could breathe. His pen had carried some of the weight, some of the grief, leaving behind only the faint spark of hope that his words might reach home. As the sun began to lower in the pale sky, the men folded their letters and packed their few belongings. Fires burned low, smoke curling into the cold air. Thomas stood, stretching sore muscles, feeling the weight of both victory and loss. He had survived Trenton, and he had written of it. Somehow, that made him feel human again. That evening, as the army settled for the night, Thomas found a quiet spot by a fire. He stared into the flames, thinking of home, of letters that would soon travel miles and months, of the faces he could not forget. And for the first time in days, he allowed himself to hope that these letters might carry not only news, but a piece of the courage he now carried within him. The stars above shimmered cold and distant, but beneath them, men wrote, prayed, whispered, and dreamed. Each letter, each word, was a small rebellion against the darkness, a way of claiming a future that might one day be free. Thomas folded his pen, tucked the letter close, and let the quiet wash over him. Tomorrow, they would march again. Tomorrow, the war would continue. But tonight, with letters in hand and memories etched in his mind, Thomas felt the fragile, enduring pulse of life. The hope that even in war, connection, love, and remembrance could survive. The march back to camp was quiet, almost reverent. The streets of Trenton lay behind them, littered with remnants of battle, scattered muskets, broken doors, and the faint scent of gunpowder lingering in the cold morning air. The men moved slowly, bodies aching, eyes distant. Each step carried the weight of yesterday's struggle. Thomas walked near Jenkins, their boots crunching over frost-hardened mud. Conversations were sparse, broken by sighs and the occasional cough. The victory felt real yet distant, like a dream one wakes from too soon. Thomas's thoughts drifted constantly to home, to the letters he had written, and to those who would never receive one. They passed farms and homesteads, some deserted, others cautiously peeking from behind shutters. Children waved timidly from porches, their eyes wide with curiosity and awe. Thomas imagined his own siblings standing there, watching him march through snow and smoke, wondering if he would return safely. The thought tightened his chest. At a small creek, the men paused to refresh themselves. The water was icy and unforgiving, but it was necessary. Soldiers knelt in the shallow current, cupping the stream in their hands, washing soot and grime from their faces. Thomas splashed cold water onto his cheeks, shivering as it burned through the weariness, and felt a fleeting sense of renewal. The column reassembled quickly. Officers reminded them to maintain formation, though discipline was now as much about habit as command. Each man knew that the march was not yet over, that the road back to camp was lined with challenges, both physical and mental. Thomas adjusted his pack and fell into step, the rhythm of movement anchoring him. As the afternoon stretched on, conversations began to return. Men spoke quietly about the battle, about the bravery of comrades, and about the fear they had faced. Laughter, soft and tentative, emerged occasionally, a release of tension, a reminder that even here, amid the echoes of war, humanity persisted. Jenkins shared stories of past skirmishes, embellishing details to coax a smile from Thomas. "Remember the time we got lost in the woods and found nothing but that frozen stream?" he said. Thomas chuckled quietly, appreciating the normalcy of humor in a day still shadowed by death. The men around them joined in, their voices blending into the muted chorus of the march. They approached the main camp as dusk fell. Smoke from the fires hung in the air, curling into the sky like lazy ghosts. Soldiers who had remained behind began preparing meals, tending to equipment, and patching tents. The familiar smells of wood smoke and stew were both comforting and jarring, a reminder that life continued despite the war. Thomas took stock of his gear, checking musket, powder, and pack. Repairs were necessary, as the crossing and battle had taken their toll. Men worked quietly together, sharing tools and advice, their movements efficient and practiced. Despite exhaustion, a sense of unity prevailed. They were rebuilding not just equipment, but morale. Night settled over the camp, soft and heavy. Fires flickered warmly against the cold, casting shadows on faces marked by weariness and determination. Soldiers gathered around them, sharing stories, offering food, and tending to wounds. Thomas listened, letting the low hum of voices and the crackle of flames calm his restless mind. He sat near a fire with Jenkins, staring into the flames. "Another day, another march," Jenkins murmured. Thomas nodded. "But today we did something that mattered." Silence followed, comfortable and contemplative. Above them, stars pierced the night sky, distant and constant, offering a small measure of solace. Thomas thought of home again, of the letters he had written, and of the lives he hoped to protect. The war was far from over, but the men around him, the shared hardships, and the victories, however small, reinforced a fragile sense of hope. For now, the camp offered safety, warmth, and a moment to remember who they were fighting for. As he lay down to rest, Thomas allowed his thoughts to drift, letting exhaustion take hold. The march had tested their bodies, the battle their courage, and the return reminded them all of the resilience that bound them together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, there was peace in the simple act of survival and the knowledge that they had endured. The night was quiet, broken only by the soft crackle of the campfires. Thomas lay on his blanket, staring at the stars piercing the inky sky. Each one seemed distant yet familiar, like an old friend he had not seen in years. The events of the past days pressed against his mind, relentless and vivid, demanding reflection. He thought of the river, frozen and merciless, and the crossing that had seemed impossible. Every step, every splash of icy water, had carried them closer to both danger and hope. He realized then that courage was not a sudden blaze but a quiet persistence. One step, one breath, one act at a time. The Battle of Trenton came alive in his mind again. Flashes of smoke, the thunder of musket fire, the cries of the fallen. Faces that had been so close, yet vanished in moments, replayed with uncanny clarity. Thomas pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to make sense of it all, but understanding was elusive. Jenkins stirred beside him, murmuring softly, "You're awake," he said. Thomas nodded, voice barely audible. "I'm thinking." Jenkins chuckled, a short, tired sound. "We all are. Some of us just hide it better." They fell silent, the quiet companionship more comforting than words could convey. Thomas recalled the letters he had written home. They were more than ink on paper. They were fragments of his soul, a way to tether himself to the life he fought to preserve. In writing, he had confronted fear, loss, and hope simultaneously. Each sentence had been a small act of survival, a testament to what it meant to remain human. He considered the men around him, farmers, tradesmen, sons of the soil, who had become soldiers by circumstance. Each had faced moments where despair could have claimed them, yet they endured. There was strength in that endurance, a silent bond that no uniform or rank could replicate. Thomas felt gratitude swell quietly in his chest. Memories of home mingled with the present, the fields of his father, the laughter of siblings, the warmth of a mother's embrace. Each image was sharp and aching, a reminder of what he fought for, and why survival mattered beyond himself. In that moment, Thomas understood the war's purpose not in strategy or orders, but in the preservation of ordinary lives. He thought too of those who had not returned. Faces of friends and comrades who would never see another sunrise, never write another letter, never walk home. A deep sorrow pressed against his chest, mingling with pride and determination. Their absence was a wound, but one that would guide him forward, honoring their memory in action. The night deepened, and Thomas found himself speaking quietly, almost to the stars. Words of reflection, gratitude, and promise. He vowed to remain steadfast, to fight with awareness and purpose, and to carry both the triumphs and losses with dignity. In the silence, these pledges felt weighty yet grounding. Jenkins stirred again, whispering, "Ever think about why we keep going?" Thomas nodded, staring at the flickering fire. "Because we must. Because it's not just about surviving today, but ensuring tomorrow exists for those who follow." His voice held certainty now, a calm amid the storm of memories. As the fire dwindled, Thomas let his thoughts drift. The war was far from over, the path ahead uncertain. Yet he felt transformed. Not by glory, but by understanding. Courage, loss, hope, and resilience had merged into a clarity that anchored him. He was no longer simply a soldier. He was a witness, a participant, a man reshaped by the journey. The wind whispered softly through the camp, rustling blankets and stirring embers. Thomas exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of reflection and the lightness of newfound purpose coexist within him. He closed his eyes, letting sleep take him, carrying with it the lessons of a soldier, the memories of home, and the quiet, enduring fire of hope. Morning came slowly, pale light spilling over the camp. Frost glimmered on blankets, muskets, and boots, painting the world in silver. Thomas rose, muscles stiff, joints aching from yesterday's march and battle. Around him, soldiers moved with quiet precision, performing morning routines as if in a trance. Feeding horses, sharpening tools, checking powder. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and melting frost. Thomas pulled his coat tight, exhaling clouds that quickly disappeared. He joined Jenkins near a fire, where the older man stirred the embers and offered a nod of greeting. "Another day," Jenkins murmured, "and who knows what it will bring?" Thomas simply nodded, letting the question linger. The soldiers assembled for inspection, boots crunching on frozen ground. Officers checked uniforms, muskets, and packs, their expressions stern but calm. Discipline was maintained even after victory, a reminder that the war did not pause for triumphs. Thomas's heart beat steadily, a rhythm of preparation and anticipation. Breakfast was meager: cold bread, scraps of salted meat, and water drawn from the creek. Men ate quietly, savoring each bite. Some spoke softly of letters they had received or sent, others of homes they longed to see again. Conversation was cautious, tinged with fatigue but also faint sparks of camaraderie and shared survival. Afterward, the men began clearing the camp, repairing tents, and tending to the wounded. Thomas helped distribute bandages and ration supplies, moving with deliberate care. Every task, no matter how small, felt significant. The army was a fragile organism, and each man's effort kept it alive, ready for the challenges ahead. As the sun rose higher, officers gave orders for the next march. The route would take them through frozen fields and small villages, each step a continuation of the campaign. Thomas adjusted his musket and pack, feeling the familiar weight. The burden was physical and emotional, yet he carried it with a sense of purpose now stronger than fear. Walking alongside Jenkins, Thomas observed his comrades. Some limped slightly, others joked quietly to mask exhaustion. Their faces, though drawn and tired, radiated resilience. Every step forward was both survival and assertion, a claim that they existed, endured, and would continue to fight for the freedom of the land they loved. The roads were narrow and icy, forcing the men to move carefully. Horses struggled in the mud, wagons creaked under supply loads, and the wind cut sharply through the ranks. Yet despite the cold and hardship, there was a rhythm to the march, a shared understanding of perseverance. The men were not merely marching, they were moving history forward. Midday brought a brief pause near a frozen stream. Soldiers knelt, drank water, and stretched aching limbs. Thomas watched the reflection of pale clouds on the icy surface, feeling the fragile beauty of the moment. It was a pause in the relentless march of war, a reminder that life, however fleeting, persisted around them. As they resumed, Thomas's mind wandered to home, to letters, to those who waited and those who had fallen. He thought of the courage that had carried them through the crossing, the battle, and the quiet aftermath. Each memory, each thought, was a thread connecting him to a larger tapestry, a story of endurance, hope, and the unyielding human spirit. Evening approached as the camp neared another small village. Fires were lit, and men began setting up tents, sharpening weapons, and preparing rations. Thomas worked methodically, aware that each act, no matter how routine, was part of survival. Around him, the men laughed softly, told stories, and shared brief moments of warmth against the cold shadow of war. Night fell, thick and quiet, blanketing the camp in darkness. Thomas sat near the fire, staring at the flickering flames, reflecting on the day. Tomorrow would bring more marching, more uncertainty, perhaps more battle. Yet tonight, he allowed himself a moment of calm, a recognition that they had endured another day together, and that endurance itself was a form of triumph. The first light of dawn stretched across the camp, soft and golden, touching frost-covered tents and weary faces. Thomas rose slowly, muscles sore, yet his spirit felt lighter. The past days had shaped him. The crossing, the battle, the letters home, each experience a layer, forging resilience he had never known. He walked among his comrades, watching them prepare for the day ahead. Faces tired, hands calloused, yet eyes bright with quiet determination. In each man, he saw the same transformation he felt within himself, ordinary people becoming part of something larger, a shared struggle etched into every step, every heartbeat. Thomas paused at the edge of the camp, staring at the distant horizon. The war stretched on, uncertain and relentless, but the fear that had once consumed him had given way to resolve. He understood now that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. He thought of home, the fields, the family, the letters he had sent, and of the fallen comrades whose faces remained etched in memory. Each sacrifice was a reminder of the cost of freedom, and each small victory a testament to endurance and hope. In that balance, Thomas found purpose, a clarity that no battle could take away. The soldiers began to march, the rhythm of their boots a steady heartbeat across the frozen ground. Thomas fell in step, musket on his shoulder, eyes forward. The journey was far from over, but he no longer felt alone or unprepared. He carried with him courage, memory, and a quiet understanding of what it meant to fight not just for survival, but for a future worth living. And as the sun rose higher, warming the frost and casting long shadows behind them, Thomas whispered to himself, "We endure, we fight, we remember, and through that, we live." In that moment, the war felt less like endless struggle and more like a testament of bravery, of hope, and of the ordinary men who, through extraordinary circumstances, shaped the course of history.